She was hungry, homeless, and alien. He gave her shelter, and now she calls this human husband. Compost wasn't just where things rotted. It was where failures were buried. Verdion Waste Cluster number 12 sat on the far edge of human jurisdiction, a forgotten station orbiting an overworked colony world. Nothing new arrived here, only the unwanted, the unstable, the unprofitable. Every day, the composter tanks digested the leftovers of dead hybrid species, outlawed graft experiments, and biotech too risky to keep alive. The smell of ammonia and decay clung to everything, even your thoughts. Officially, Leo Fenn was a field biowaste technician. Unofficially, he was the caretaker of the planet's mistakes. Most people lasted 6 days out here. Leo had lasted 6 years. The early shift always started before dawn, though dawn on Verdion meant a sickly bronze haze filtering through sulfur-thick clouds. The sky above the domes churned like an old bruise, never fully dark or light. It didn't matter. The field composters never stopped cycling. Leo moved between the tanks with practiced slowness, boots squelching through black, acidic mud. The air was thick with humidity and chemical musk, the kind that stuck in your lungs and made you taste metal for hours. He didn't mind it anymore. The silence was worse. The silence always felt permanent. Stomper, his half-functioning maintenance droid, limped in the background, clanking somewhere behind Tank C-11. Leo ignored it. He was focused on the mound slumped near the open composter. It shouldn't have caught his eye. At first glance, it looked like any other decomposing root cluster, maybe part of the failed Envil vine trials from last season. But something about the way it curled, the suggestion of symmetry in the shape, it triggered something in him. He squinted, took a step closer, and then he saw the hand. Not a plant, not decay, a body, half submerged in steaming mulch, wrapped in gauze-like organic fiber, caked in slime, her limbs tucked tightly inward as if trying to vanish into the rot. Leo dropped into a crouch, heart climbing slowly but steadily into his throat. His first thought was that she was dead, but then the body twitched, barely, just the tremor of a breath, so faint he thought he imagined it. And then the head lifted just slightly. A face turned toward him. Not human. Her skin was the color of wilted lavender, mottled with sickly, faded vine patterns. Long strands of green hair hung in clumps across her cheeks, soaked with mulch. But her eyes, they were what held him. Matte black, glassless, yet sharp as obsidian. They locked onto his. She opened her mouth. A brittle crack split her lips. Then a sound, soft and strange, slipped out. A single word in a tongue the translator implant couldn't parse. It wasn't gibberish. It was language, alive. Protocol was clear. Unidentified sentients found in waste zones were to be immediately reported. Biohazard first, legal assessment later. But Leo didn't move for his calm. He'd seen what happened to non-compliant biotics turned in through official channels. He pulled off one glove and knelt beside her, close enough to feel the wet heat of the compost rising off her skin. Gently, he brushed a tangle of green hair from her cheek. Her skin flinched under his touch, then stilled. She didn't pull away. "Not dead," he murmured. The words felt like a promise. Getting her out of the mulch was slow work. The organic runoff had fused to her body like second skin. Her arms were thin, tremoring. One foot was raw from exposure, nails cracked and blackened. She didn't speak again, didn't resist, but she watched everything. Her gaze tracked every move he made, calculating, like an animal trying to decide if a hand offered help or harm. She weighed nothing. He carried her in both arms through the outer corridor, steam trailing behind them like spilled breath. Inside the primary dome, light filtered dimly through cracked glass. Condensation dripped from the ceiling in soft, wet taps. Most of the station's modules were long abandoned. Only Leo's quarters still had any warmth in them. He nudged open the door with his boot and laid her down on the sleeping mat in the corner. It was a patchwork of dried moss and synthetic fiber. Not much comfort, but better than mulch and acid wind. She didn't relax. Her limbs stayed curled tight to her chest, her breath shallow, chest barely rising. Leo stripped off his coat and draped it over her. Then he filled a basin with warm tank water and fetched a clean cloth. He didn't ask for permission. Just dipped the rag and began to wipe the grime from her face. The muck came off in layers. Beneath it, her skin wasn't just lavender. It shimmered faintly in places. thin bioluminescent threads woven across her collarbone and neck like faded scars. Vines, or something that used to be vines. She flinched at every new contact, muscles twitching like a spliced stem under stress. But she didn't retreat, didn't speak. Her eyes never left him. When he finished, he placed a bowl of fungal broth beside her. She turned her face away. He didn't push. Instead, Leo cleaned his hands, sorted the sample trays on the bench, and recorded today's decay ratios into his log manually. He kept his movements slow, quiet. Nothing sudden. Let her watch. Night came. The temperature dipped. The compost fields outside pulsed faintly, glowing with dying light. She didn't sleep. Neither did he. Hours passed. Then, a sound, not speech. A clatter. The bowl. She had reached out with shaking fingers, pulled it close. Her hand trembled so hard she spilled broth over the edge. But she drank. First in short gulps, like someone afraid it would vanish. Then slower. She coughed. Her body folded inward with the motion, shoulders heaving, chest rattling. She wheezed quietly, then drank again. A drop clung to her chin. She wiped it with the back of her hand. Leo didn't speak. Just turned the room's heating unit up another notch and dimmed the lights further. She finished the broth, set the bowl down like it weighed more than her arm, and curled up, not as tightly as before. The coat slipped off one shoulder, revealing more of the light tracing her skin. It pulsed faintly, barely visible, but not random. A pattern, a rhythm, like the hum of a plant growing toward light. A memory surfaced in Leo's mind, a research log he'd once read about a species engineered to interface with crops. Empaths for living fields. Not machines, not tools, people, grown, not born. Discarded when they failed. He watched her chest rise and fall, soft now, still awake, still tracking him, but less afraid. Outside, something cracked faintly against the dome, probably a vine root expanding through the outer membrane. Verdion was always slowly being reclaimed by its own waste. Leo sat beside the door, back against the frame. He didn't sleep, but his breathing steadied. His eyes closed. That light on her skin barely more than a flicker. But light meant more than survival. It meant something was waking up, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what that would become. The light through the dome wasn't sunlight, not really. Just the illusion of it, filtered through industrial haze and the sickly amber clouds that never cleared over Verdion. But it was enough to wake Leo. He opened his eyes slowly, joints stiff from sleeping against the wall. His body had learned to make do with hard surfaces and odd angles. But this time, when he sat up and glanced toward the mat in the corner, he felt something unfamiliar. Relief. She was still there. Her body hadn't moved much, but the way she lay had changed. The tight protective curl was looser now, one arm flung softly across the moss bedding, her hair fanned out around her like wet grass left to dry. The coat had slipped off her shoulders sometime in the night. Beneath it, her skin caught the low dome light just enough to reveal faint traces of those strange pulsing patterns, bioluminescent lines like the ghost of old vines. She didn't stir when he rose, not at first, but when the water hissed in the kettle, she shifted, eyelids fluttering, her eyes opened slowly. Matte and expressionless at first, then fixed on him, not startled, not panicked, just watching, as if confirming that he was still real, still here. Leo nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and turned back to the counter. The burner clicked on. He poured tank-filtered water into the tin pot and dropped in the dried root shavings. Bitter, but warm. Good enough. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just placed the bowl beside her again. Thicker broth this time, a few softened root pieces floating like promise, and waited. She sat up cautiously, her muscles slow to obey. The blanket slipped from her lap as she reached for the bowl, fingers trembling slightly, but with more control than the night before. She didn't look at him as she ate, but she didn't hide her hunger either. She drank it all. And this time, when she finished, she set the bowl down with deliberate care. Progress, Leo thought. He stepped toward the dome hatch, feeling her eyes follow him. I have to check the south compost tanks, he said, half turning to gauge her reaction. You can stay here, safe, warm. She didn't move, didn't speak. But as soon as the door hissed open, she rose. Her bare feet touched the floor with a hesitant slap. She swayed slightly, steadying herself against the wall. The burns and cracks along her soles hadn't healed overnight, but she ignored them. She followed him. Not close, not far. just near enough to say, "I'm still deciding." Outside, the humidity wrapped around them like wet cloth. The ground squelched beneath each step, black mud clinging to their legs. Leo moved through it without thought, but she moved carefully, pausing between steps, watching the way the wind carried spores across the surface of the waste fields, the way the air vibrated with chemical tension. The south quadrant was worse than yesterday. Too much runoff. The tanks were overfed again, half-melted hybrids of kelp and desert vine collapsing into rot. Leo made a face behind his mask and sighed. The nutrient balance was off. If the compost wasn't aerated soon, it would turn septic. He knelt beside one of the decaying root clusters and pulled his shears from his belt. Reaching for the thickest vine, he froze. Her hand had closed around his wrist. She didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just held him still. Then slowly she shook her head. He stared at her, then back at the vine. On the surface, it looked strangled, choking the roots beneath it. But now he saw the faint pulse traveling through it, subtle like breath. The vine wasn't a parasite. It was feeding something below. He let his hand drop. She crouched beside him, her green hair hanging like riverweed over her shoulder. She pointed to the base of the growth, then gestured sideways, tracing the soil with her finger. She was showing him something, not just a single cut, but the whole system, not broken, misaligned. Leo watched as she pressed her palm into the soil. Then she hummed. It wasn't a melody, more like a vibration, a low, fragmented sound that seemed to echo in the roots. The ground didn't move, not in any way visible, but the rot softened. The tension in the soil changed. It was subtle but undeniable. When she stood, Leo stepped back to give her room. She moved from one tank to the next, touching stalks, inspecting decay patterns, ignoring the worst of the mold and sludge. When she passed a collapsed mycelium bed, she knelt again, laid her hand across the surface, and whispered something he couldn't hear. A few seconds later, the dying bed pulsed with faint green light. Just once. Leo stared. It wasn't healing. Not really. But something in it responded to her, as if recognizing her presence, as if she belonged. He didn't interrupt, just followed quietly, making notes in his head, adjusting tank metrics later to match what she'd shown him. When they returned to the dome, she walked straighter, still favoring her left foot, still tired, but no longer looking like she might collapse at any moment. He offered her gloves. She hesitated. They were too big, clearly made for his hands, patched and stained from years of use. But after a moment, she took them and pulled them on. The fingers sagged awkwardly. She flexed them, then nodded once. Inside, the air felt cooler, quieter. The storm haze hadn't broken, but something in the station had shifted. Leo returned to the greenhouse module, one of the few places still semi-operational, and began sorting old root samples. The crate had been sealed for years, half buried under dust and cracked nutrient packets. At the bottom, tucked between two folders warped with mold, he found it. An interface logbook, written in an archaic off-world dialect. He scanned the pages, notes on failed graphs, genetic drift ratios, even a diagram of a symbiotic neural system once used to link crops to living conductors. One entry stood out, a name, Yeri. He read it aloud softly, not asking, just saying it, like a memory coming back. She looked up. She had settled near the far wall again, her legs drawn up, her back resting against the moss-lined insulation. Her expression didn't change, but her gaze locked onto his. Yeri, he repeated. She blinked slowly. Then, with a breath so quiet it almost wasn't there, she dipped her chin. Confirmation. A name reclaimed. That night, Leo found a small stone beside his bowl. Not native to Verdion, he'd know. Its surface was carved with a spiral pattern. Crude, but deliberate. A message. He didn't ask what it meant. He just picked it up and held it in his palm until the compost beds outside began to pulse with their nightly glow. Yeri said nothing. She sat in the corner, eyes closed, breathing calm and steady. But Leo saw it in the way her hands rested more openly on her lap. She wasn't hiding anymore. Something was growing here, not just in the soil, not just in the tanks, in the silence between them, and it was alive. The station's recycled air hissed softly as the internal pressure adjusted, pushing warm, filtered humidity through narrow vents. Outside, the compost fields glowed faintly, patches of pale green and soft violet pulsing just beneath the surface like buried stars struggling to breathe. Leo stood at the doorway to his quarters, one hand on the frame, watching Yeri from across the room. She was sitting with her back to him, her posture no longer defensive, but not relaxed either. Her long green hair was still clumped with bits of dried compost, tangled where roots and slime had crusted in. Her skin, soft lilac, where it was visible, carried the dull shadow of rot that hadn't fully faded. The gloves he'd given her earlier were folded neatly beside her on the moss mat, and the stone she'd left him the night before sat tucked beside them. The spiral still glinted faintly in the low dome light. She needed a bath. That thought, simple, human, lodged itself in Leo's mind with surprising clarity, not out of discomfort, not out of duty. It felt respectful, like a small act of restoration no one else had ever offered her. He moved to the back module, where the emergency decontamination bay had long since been converted into a half-functioning washroom. The sonic cleanser had died years ago, and the auto scrubbers were more rust than machine now, but he'd rerouted enough tank heat to keep the water warm. He tested the temperature, adjusted the pressure valve, and let the condensation rise before he returned. She looked up as he approached, eyes sharp as ever. Alert. Always alert. He gestured toward the back corridor, not forcing, not asking. "I have water running," he said. "Warm, if you want." She didn't respond, not with words, but her eyes didn't narrow, her shoulders didn't rise. She looked down, considered something, then stood. Slowly. Her movements were measured, almost ritualistic. She followed him down the corridor in silence. At the washroom entrance, she stopped and glanced at the fixtures, old, mismatched components bolted into cracked walls, the kind of place no one stayed in long enough to repair properly. She hesitated. Then she stepped inside. Leo turned the heat up a notch and handed her a fresh cloth, a bar of solid cleanser, and a small basin of soaking moss that held the faint scent of crushed mint root. She took them with both hands, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. He stepped back without speaking and left her alone. The door sealed behind her with a sigh. Leo sat just outside, back against the corridor wall, watching the steam curl from beneath the edge of the door. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard someone else's footsteps echo in the metal halls. He could hear the splash of water, the shift of weight as she moved. Quiet, deliberate. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Inside, Yeri moved with slow determination. The water was hot, almost too hot for her skin, which had spent weeks beneath cold compost and chemical runoff, but she didn't pull away. She dipped the cloth, ran it over her arms, her legs, her neck. The slime came off in layers. The smell of rot lifted gradually, replaced by damp metal, earth, and that faint mint edge. Her hair was the hardest part. The vines had embedded themselves deep, threading through the strands like they had tried to root into her scalp. She soaked it for minutes before even trying to work her fingers through. By the time she finished, her skin shimmered faintly again. Not bright, not yet. But the vine-like markings across her collarbones and arms were visible now, fine as brush strokes, curling like calligraphy in a forgotten language. She stared at herself in the cracked metal panel above the basin, not quite a mirror, but enough to see the outline of her face. For a long time she didn't move. Her breath fogged the steel. Then she turned, wrapped herself in the rough fiber towel Leo had left, and stepped back into the corridor. He didn't look up immediately, just tilted his head slightly at the sound of her footsteps. When he did meet her gaze, he paused. Her hair was still wet, long strands clinging to her collarbone, catching the light in fine threads of green. Her posture had shifted again, straighter now, still silent but more present. She set the cloth and the basin down carefully beside him. Then after a moment of stillness, she reached up and touched her own chest. She tapped once, just over her heart. "Yeri," she said. Her voice was low, hoarse, but steady. Leo blinked. It wasn't the name itself that startled him. It was the fact that she had offered it, freely, without being asked. "I know," he replied softly. "I found it in the logs." She tilted her head slightly, not surprised, just curious. "And you?" she rasped. He smiled faintly. "Leo." There was no ceremony in the exchange. Just two names passed between two people who didn't owe them to anyone else. She sat across from him, cross-legged, arms draped loosely across her knees, damp hair dripping quietly onto the floor. The silence between them felt different now, not hollow, not afraid, just quiet, like soil before the sprout. That night, she didn't return to the corner. Instead, when the lights dimmed and Leo lay down on his side of the room, she crossed over, wordlessly, and curled up near the heat coil, not touching, but close enough that her bioluminescence softened the shadows across the floor. Her breathing was steady, deeper. Later, just before sleep took him, she made a sound. A breathy exhale, not quite laughter, but not pain either. Leo turned his head. Stomper, his clunky lopsided maintenance droid, had wandered in half-functioning as usual and walked straight into a wall, again. It buzzed in confusion, pivoted awkwardly, then beeped once and powered down where it stood. Yeri looked at the robot, then at Leo. She shook her head slightly and smiled. It was a small smile, crooked and faint, but real. Leo didn't say a word, but he felt something shift in him, just a little, like compost turning under heat, quiet, slow, inevitable. By morning, one of the root blooms in the eastern field had begun to unfurl. It was the first living bloom the station had seen in 3 years. The days had turned heavy. The air, usually thick with humid decay, felt denser, charged with something neither of them could name. The compost fields thrived, roots pushing up through the softened crust like breath through lungs. The silence between Yeri and Leo was no longer cold or cautious. It had become something else, lived in, worn soft. But quiet isn't peace, not always. It was nearly dusk when Yeri heard the first low hum. Mechanical, distant, wrong. She dropped the moss she'd been weaving into the compost lattice and turned sharply toward the outer field line. A flicker, there, just above the far horizon, artificial light. Not from the station, a beacon. Leo looked up from the nutrient tank and saw her expression change. He didn't ask. He already knew. They came back. Within an hour, the shuttle breached the perimeter. No warning, no authorization ping. Smaller than the first, unmarked, but the stink of the Dominion still clung to it. Corporate salvage teams always returned for things they thought belonged to them. Leo met them at the entrance, alone. The two strangers wore the same sterile uniforms, gray, polished, without identity. Their boots left clean scars in the mud. "You're not cleared for entry," Leo said. "We're here to retrieve proprietary biotech," the taller one said, already walking forward. "Asset number 2119, tagged female variant, partial resonance class." "She's not an asset." "You don't get to decide that." Leo stepped into the path, mud squelching under his weight. He didn't reach for a weapon. There wasn't one to reach for, but his voice dropped low. "You abandoned her. She grew." The shorter one tapped a wrist pad. Signal readings suggest a re-established neural field within the compost zone. That means the subject is still active. That makes her reclaimable under contract clause. "Not anymore." They didn't respond. Behind the security hatch, Yeri stood in the dark, watching through a seam in the doorframe. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling, one clutching the smooth stone she'd carved days ago. Her light flickered across her skin, erratic. She had been prepared for this. At least she'd told herself that. But when Leo said it, when he stood between them and spoke as if she were worth protecting, something inside her shifted. No one had done that before, not truly, not without strings, not without expecting her to repay it in data or obedience or silence. When the strangers left, they did so not out of respect, but out of caution. Leo had made it clear he would log everything, and while the company might not care about one compost field tech, they did care about exposure. The shuttle lifted back into the sky, its thrusters disturbing the upper canopy of wild vines now rooted along the dome's outer wall. But Yeri didn't relax. That night, the silence inside the station was louder than the shuttle had been. She sat near the moss bed, knees pulled to her chest, hair falling loose around her face. Leo sat on the floor nearby, his back against the wall, watching the steam rise from a forgotten cup of tea. Finally, she spoke. "They called us tender class. Our function was empathy. We were made to feel what couldn't be measured, to interpret stress in root structures, to sense dehydration before the soil cracked, to read the grief of dying green." She didn't look at him, just at her hands, now folded on her lap. "I was one of 12. We were vat-grown on a station orbiting a planet they never named. We weren't given mothers or mirrors, just soil and song." Her voice was steady, but her shoulders were too still, too tight. "They bonded us to the root fields through a living mesh. It wrapped around our spines, our veins. Every breath we took fed the data stream, and for a while it worked. Plants responded. Yields tripled. The company celebrated. Investors cheered. She paused. Leo said nothing. But the plants began to change. Unpredictably, they grew toward us, not the light. Root systems tangled around our legs. One of the others, her name was Elith. She stopped speaking, not because she was broken, because the vines started doing it for her. Yeri's hands clenched. Her fingertips glowed faintly now, pulsing under the skin. They called it contamination, said our emotional resonance interfered with plant stability, that we were leaking something unquantifiable into the crop fields. They ran diagnostics, found nothing, so they declared the project compromised. Leo could hear the breath catch in her throat, not a sob, just a break. They unlinked the interfaces one by one, quietly, no announcements, no alarms. I wasn't terminated because my readings were always inconsistent. I was useful for study, but I knew what that meant, so I ran. Now her voice cracked. I walked through decay, drank runoff from nutrient tanks, slept in mulch heaps. I watched my skin dim until I thought I'd gone blind. And then I found the waste fields. She looked at him now. Her eyes didn't plead. They didn't explain, they just were. I thought I would die there. You didn't, Leo said softly. No, she agreed, because you didn't step back. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. You weren't something to avoid. Number I was something to compost. Her words hit harder than any threat from a corporate salvager. He looked down at the floor between them. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she shifted. Her body turned toward him, not fully, not boldly, but with care. With will. She reached out. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just one hand open, tentative. He met her halfway. Fingers met palm, warm, alive. She took a slow breath, then laid their joined hands on the floor between them, like planting something delicate. My light, she said quietly, isn't what it was. It might never be. It doesn't need to be, he replied. Her thumb brushed across his knuckles. Her touch didn't ask for comfort. It gave it. You shouldn't have had to stand between me and them. I'd do it again. She smiled, but only barely. It wasn't joy. It was relief. You're not afraid? I was, he said. Not of them, of losing this. This? He gestured around them. The silence, the breath of the soil, the feeling that for once I didn't have to explain myself. Yeri's gaze softened. She moved closer now, slowly, until her shoulder brushed his, until their arms rested side by side. I want to stay, she said. Leo turned to her. You already have. Outside, the compost fields shimmered under the night cycle. Vines shifted against the dome wall, curling like fingers in sleep. Inside, two lives that had been discarded began to knit something back together. Not a program, not a system, a life. And beneath their hands, the soil grew warm. Night on Verdian didn't fall. It thickened. Clouds sagged lower over the dome. The outer compost beds pulsed with soft green and violet hues, residue of the bioluminescent root networks she had helped awaken. But inside the greenhouse module, everything was still. Leo sat in the quiet, bent over a cracked ceramic bowl, steam curling upward from a root broth he hadn't touched. Across the room, Yeri moved like mist, her bare feet silent on the metal grit floor. She drifted near the drying table, her fingers trailing across the clean moss cloth she'd folded that morning. She hadn't spoken since sharing her story. She didn't need to. It lingered in the air like humidity, clinging to every object in the room. Leo finally set the bowl down and stood. He didn't speak either. Just moved to the basin where tank-filtered water sat waiting, warmed slightly by the low generator hum beneath the floor. With practiced care, he wet a clean cloth and wrung it out. Yeri turned to watch him. He didn't look at her as he returned. He simply offered the cloth, not pressing, not asking. An offering, not a solution. She stepped closer, then reached out, not for the cloth, but for him. Her hand, still damp with the compost oils she had rubbed into the East Quadrant roots earlier, brushed his forearm. Slowly, with quiet deliberation, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, just above his heart. Her hand stayed there, steady. Leo froze, not from fear, but from something deeper, something sacred. Her markings flickered softly where skin met fabric. The light bled through the thin layer of his shirt like the pulse of some buried seed stirring to life. She was close now, her breath warming the space between them. No words. Her eyes were wide, not in hesitation, but in awareness, as if memorizing him, as if testing whether this presence, this nearness, would crack her or hold her. He placed his hand gently over hers, nothing more. It wasn't about pulling her closer. It was about not letting her stand alone. She exhaled, and something in her posture unwound. Shoulders that had held tension since the day she arrived dropped a fraction. Her chin dipped. Her forehead touched his collarbone. A beat passed, then another, then her voice, barely audible. "You compost what's thrown away." So I grew. Leo's breath caught. No answer came to mind. None would be enough. He simply let his arms encircle her, not tightly, not possessively, just enough to let her know she was held. Yeri's body softened against him, not like someone collapsing, but like someone finally allowed to rest. Her cheek pressed to his shoulder, her fingers curled into his side. Leo had always believed the rot told its own story, that nothing ever truly vanished, that what broke down fed what came next. But this was the first time he felt it in his bones. Nothing wasted, nothing lost, only transformed. They stood like that for a long time. When she finally stepped back, she didn't let go completely. Her hand remained in his. Their fingers linked, and she guided him gently toward the far side of the quarters, where the insulation layers were thickest, and the ground mat rested beneath a soft net of moss and dried root fiber. She sat first, cross-legged, bare-legged, unafraid. He followed, knees cracking slightly, as he sank down beside her. Yeri didn't lie down right away. Instead, she took his hand again and brought it to her chest, over the same place she'd touched before, her own heartbeat steady beneath his palm. Her skin was warm. Her markings glowed softly, responding to the pressure. Not bright, not performative, just alive. Then she leaned in. She didn't kiss him like a human might, her forehead pressed to his. Their breath mingled in the narrow space between them, and that was enough. Her lips touched his a moment later, gentle, intentional. A first kiss in the oldest sense of the word. Recognition, not possession, not hunger, but a joining. His hand slid to her jaw, cradling her face, thumb brushing the curve of her cheek. Her glow brightened. When the kiss ended, they remained close, breath shared, hands twined. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. He could feel her voice against his chest more than he heard it. "Neither am I," he said. Outside, the wind shifted. A new storm front gathered, but the dome held steady. Compost beds expanded as the root system surged below the surface, feeding on everything that had once been discarded. Inside, Yeri curled beside him under the moss layers. She didn't ask if she could. He didn't need her to. She slept with one hand resting over his heart, and Leo, for the first time since arriving on Verdian, didn't lie awake listening for alarms, because this warmth, this presence, this gentle weight beside him wasn't an anomaly. It was sanctuary. In the pre-dawn stillness, the fields pulsed. A new bloom rose from the center quadrant, tall, steady, unlike anything previously recorded in the cluster's data logs. Its petals shimmered violet and silver in the low light. A hybrid, a miracle. In the control room, sensors flagged it as non-native, unclassified, unclaimed. Leo didn't bother logging it. He only whispered to himself as Yeri stirred in her sleep. She wasn't planted here. She chose to grow. And the field listened. And it grew too. The field had changed, not just in color or yield, but in rhythm. The roots now pulsed with a steady breath, their cycles no longer chaotic, no longer random. Everything moved with quiet intention. Leo stood at the edge of the south dome, arms crossed, watching as stalks once deemed sterile curled skyward in slow arcs, buds swelling at their tips. The rot that used to dominate this quadrant had receded. In its place, growth. Not forced, not engineered, earned. Behind him, Yeri knelt in the loam, her hands deep in the mulch, body swaying faintly with the motion of the vines as if answering a call only she could hear. Her bioluminescent markings glowed low and warm, not flaring, not flickering, steady. She didn't speak. Neither did he. There was no need. The silence between them had become a shared language. At the center of the bed, a new bloom cracked open. White-veined petals folded outward, releasing a subtle fragrance. Mineral, clean, unlike anything recorded in Verdian's logs. Yeri stood. Her palms were coated in soil, her knees stained from the field, but her posture was proud. Not performative, rooted. She looked toward Leo and gave a single subtle nod. He returned it without hesitation. They walked back together, Steps slow, synchronized, not by planning, but by presence. The sky above them churned in its usual amber haze, but the wind today was different, softer, a hush instead of a warning. Inside the main quarters, Yeri moved toward the wash basin while Leo activated the console and checked the compost chamber logs. No anomalies, no rot surges, only stable growth. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her stripping off her field wrap, revealing the fine lattice of vine markings along her back. She lowered herself beside the basin and began rinsing her arms, methodical, unhurried. Leo didn't stare, but he didn't look away either. Her skin, once dull with toxin stains and fear, now gleamed with soft blue-green light. Her movements held ease, trust, as though for the first time she wasn't bracing for pain. When she finished, she turned to him, drying her hands on a moss-weave cloth. She held something in her palm. He tilted his head. She stepped closer and placed it in his hand. A small carving, smoothed from dark compost stone. The shape, a spiral, but layered now. 2 paths entwined, not one. "You carved this?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. He looked at it for a long moment. "What does it mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up, brushing her thumb along the edge of his jaw. Then softly, "I stay." 2 words. No explanation, but he understood. Leo's breath hitched, not from surprise but from the weight of that choice. Of all the places she could have drifted to, of all the silences she could have curled into again, she stayed with him. "Then I stay too," he said simply. That night, as the dome lights dimmed into the night cycle, they shared tea in silence. Yeri sat cross-legged on the floor mat, her hair damp from a full rinse, loose around her shoulders. Leo sat beside her, back against the wall, his hands wrapped around a warm cup. Stomper whirred quietly near the vent, now more a companion than a tool. Moss had grown over half his casing, vines wrapping around his support struts like a clumsy embrace. Leo glanced at Yeri, who was watching the droid with a rare softness in her expression. "He's still trying," Leo said. Her lips curled faintly. "Then he belongs here." After a long pause, she turned to him. Her gaze was steady now, no longer guarded. "In my language," she began, "when someone stays beside you, not for protection, not for function, but because the soil grows better in their presence, we call them Husari." Leo tilted his head. "What does that mean?" She traced a finger over the back of his hand, slow, deliberate. "Soil-bound, or husband." His breath stilled, not from surprise, from recognition. The word didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel claimed. It felt grown, like the result of a long, patient season. He looked down at their joined hands. "And you?" he asked, voice quiet. "I was never planted," she said. "But I took root." Leo didn't answer. He set his cup down and leaned forward, forehead brushing hers, their breath mingling in the quiet between them. Her eyes fluttered closed, and when he kissed her, it was not tentative nor urgent. It was steady, like rain on soil that had waited too long. When they separated, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the beat beneath his ribs. Outside, a notification blinked on the outer console. Incoming craft, no logo, no authorization tag, unscheduled. Leo's gaze hardened. Yeri didn't move. She sat up slowly, brushed her fingers down the length of her forearm, and looked him in the eye. "We don't hide anymore," he nodded. They rose together. The transport landed with an unceremonious thud, sleek, quiet. A single pilot emerged, tall, younger, unfamiliar, civilian. He carried a small case and a data pad. "Sorry," he said, blinking against the mist. "I'm here on behalf of Central Agri-Support. Got flagged for something weird in your compost growth logs. HQ didn't understand how you're registering fresh chloroplast signals in a deadbed zone." Leo stared at him. "I didn't submit any logs." The man shrugged. "Then your field did." He looked past Leo toward the blooming dome, where bioluminescent vines curled along the roof and down through the compost vents. His brows lifted. "That's not standard Dominion flora." "No," Yeri said, stepping into view. Her voice was calm, even. "I don't think I have clearance for this conversation," the man muttered. "You don't," Leo replied. "But you're standing on new ground now, so either stay and learn or walk away and forget." The man glanced between them, then at the roots curling toward his boots. He stepped back, slowly. "I'll update the log as a ghost ping, signal interference, thermal bloom, whatever." He turned. But before he reached his shuttle, he looked over his shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've never seen rot look that alive." Then he was gone. That night, Yeri lay beside Leo in the moss-lined chamber, her head resting against his shoulder, one hand tangled in his shirt. He didn't speak, just held her. And when she finally whispered the word, husband, she didn't mean it as a title. She meant it as a home. And he answered, without hesitation, wife. The fields bloomed through the night, not in silence, but in song, root hum and petal pulse, a language no scanner could translate, but they understood every word, and the station, once dead, pulsed with breath again, not reclaimed, reborn. The morning came thick with mist, not the kind born from malfunctioning vents or chemical runoff, but real condensation, rolling over the compost fields like breath from a sleeping giant. The roots pulsed softly beneath it, humming low and content. For the first time in recorded station history, Verdion's waste dome didn't reek of decay. It smelled like rain-soaked soil and living green. Leo stood barefoot near the eastern quadrant, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a spade in one hand, the other steadying a growing vine. The bloom had unfurled overnight, thick-petaled, bioluminescent, and entirely undocumented. Its roots had split the old containment mesh clean through. He didn't stop it. He didn't need to. Behind him, Yeri emerged from the greenhouse corridor. She moved like part of the weather, silent, unhurried, connected to everything. Her bare feet didn't sink into the earth anymore. The field seemed to lift her. She carried a small cloth bundle wrapped in woven moss. When she reached his side, she crouched without a word and opened it. Inside, hand-pressed seeds sorted by shape and texture, not categorized by any known database, just felt, understood. She held one up between two fingers. It shimmered faintly in the filtered dome light. "This one was singing before it cracked," she said softly. Leo took it and cradled it like a breath. They worked together for hours, no instructions, no plans, just intuition, rhythm, and trust. The soil welcomed them. The field had ceased to be a battleground. It was now a home. By mid-cycle, the interior of the dome shimmered with color, streaks of violet growth along the northern vents, fresh root webs curling around the water reclamation tanks. Everything they had touched bore life. The station no longer looked like an outpost. It looked like a sanctuary. It wasn't just theirs anymore, it was itself. Later, when the sky bruised into dusk, Yeri stood at the edge of the dome, her gaze turned outward. The horizon bent under heat distortion, curling with chemical haze. But she wasn't watching for danger. She was listening. Behind her, Leo approached, quiet, his hands dusted with soil, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "They haven't come back," she said, still facing the horizon. "Maybe they won't. If they do," he stepped beside her, "they'll find roots deeper than anything they understand." She glanced at him. There was a shift in her expression then, small, subtle, but enough. A softening, not fear, not relief, a beginning. "I used to think I had no shape without them," she said, "that everything I was came from being made for them. And now?" She reached down, dug her fingers into the soil at her feet, and let it crumble between her palms. "Now I know the shape I take comes from what I tend." They stood together as the dome lights dimmed to simulate twilight. Stomper whirred past them, his moss-covered frame humming faintly, one vine draped over his side like a sash. He beeped in content confusion. Yeri smiled. Inside the quarters, they moved through the motions of evening without ceremony. Leo boiled water. Yeri stirred moss-root paste. They ate from the same bowl, knees touching as they sat cross-legged on the floor mat, the air around them thick with warmth. After the meal, Yeri stood and crossed to the outer wall, where the spiral carving she had made hung beside the console, two entwined paths etched into dark stone. She turned to face him, her eyes glowing softly in the low light. "Will you come with me?" He nodded, stood, and followed. They walked together to the southern greenhouse dome, the one they had once considered unsalvageable. Now it was the most alive. She led him to the center of the room. There, surrounded by newly risen shoots, she turned. "I never said it before," she said, voice low. He tilted his head. "Said what?" She reached for his hand. "That I chose you." He didn't reply, just stepped closer, took her hand in both of his. "I called you husband before I knew what that meant," she said, "before I had a name for what I was growing toward." "And now?" he asked, voice barely a breath. Her other hand rose to touch his chest, fingers spreading over his heart. Now I know. You were never soil I was planted in. You were the rain. Leo's eyes burned. He didn't answer with words. He kissed her. Not a beginning, not a climax. An acknowledgement. She leaned into him, arms circling his waist, body fitting against his without hesitation. Her forehead rested against his. Their breaths mingled and the silence between them filled with the sound of life. When they finally separated, she pressed something into his hand. It was a seed, but unlike any other. It pulsed with slow light. It was warm, alive. Let the world come, she said. Let them try to take. They won't understand it, he murmured, looking down at the seed. They don't have to, she said. It's not theirs. That night, they didn't return to the mat. They lay in the heart of the southern dome, curled together in the roots they had tended, surrounded by the green they had coaxed from rot. Yeri's hand never left his chest. Leo's fingers tangled in her hair. Outside, the fields pulsed gently in time with their breathing. Nothing hunted them now. Nothing claimed them. They were not fugitives, not failed prototypes, not caretakers of decay. They were gardeners, builders, family. And in the soil around them, something new stirred, not human, not alien, a future. In the morning, the first vine reached through the upper dome and cracked open its seed. The bloom was violet and gold, edged in silver, unrecorded, unrepeatable, alive. The dome was warm, not from heat coils or recycled vents, but from sunlight filtered through the newly grown canopy that now arched over the eastern quadrant. The vines had climbed to the top of the structure and woven themselves into a green lattice, allowing golden light to dapple the soil below in slow, swaying patterns. Leo lay on his back in the moss, arms folded behind his head, eyes half closed. The sound of Stomper somewhere in the distance, beeping as he failed again to sort leaves by density, made him smile. It had been a quiet day. No emergency signals, no rot alarms, no threats humming in orbit, just growth. Somewhere behind him, water trickled gently from the filtration system, cascading over carved stone and feeding into a shallow root basin. Yeri had built the structure herself, shaping each line with her hands. She said it calmed the roots. He believed her. He didn't hear her approach, but then he felt her. The faint shift of air, the soft sound of bare feet brushing moss. She lay down beside him wordlessly, her body curling sideways, one arm draping over his chest. He turned his head toward her. Her hair spilled like silk across his collarbone, damp at the tips from rinsing. "Hey," he murmured, voice thick from stillness. She hummed in response, a soft vibration against his ribs. He reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was sun-warmed, the bioluminescent patterns faint now, faded to a soft glow that barely touched the surface. "You've been quiet today," he said. "I've been listening," she replied. He tilted his head. "To what?" "The roots, the wind, you." She lifted herself slightly, leaning over him now, her hair forming a curtain between them and the rest of the world. Her face hovered above his, just inches away. Her eyes, deep, black, and shining, searched his like she was reading more than surface. Leo smiled up at her. "What did you hear?" She didn't answer immediately. Her hand rose and rested gently on his chest, fingers spreading over the space above his heart. "I heard peace," she said. Then she leaned down and kissed him. It was slow, deep, not urgent, not searching, just present. He tasted warmth and soil, sweet root tea on her breath, the faint mineral trace of moss water. Her lips moved against his with quiet certainty, like someone who had stopped asking if she was allowed to feel this, and had finally decided to simply feel it. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulled her gently down against him. She settled there, face against his neck, her breath calming into the rhythm of his. After a long silence, she spoke again, so softly he almost missed it. "My husband," Leo's eyes closed. Not from exhaustion, from impact. No translator this time, no language barrier, just her voice in perfect, clear common. "My husband," she repeated, lifting her head, looking at him again. "Not because I was saved, not because I was claimed, but because I chose to stay." His hand came up to cradle her jaw, thumb brushing the curve of her cheek. He didn't speak. His throat was too tight. She leaned into his touch. "I was built to feel the earth," she whispered. "But you taught me how to feel alive in it." He pulled her down to him again, kissed her with both hands in her hair this time, stronger, deeper. Her body melted against him, and for a moment, there was no station, no field, no past, only warmth, breath, and shared heartbeat. When they finally broke apart, she stayed close, resting her forehead against his. "I love you," she said, the words strange on her tongue, but true. "I didn't know what that was until you stood still beside me." Leo's eyes shimmered. He kissed her temple and held her close. "I'd stand beside you forever," he said, voice hoarse, "husband or not." She smiled, wide, bright, unguarded. "But you are," she whispered, "mine." Outside, the vines bloomed in silence, and under their canopy of green, two people, once discarded, once forgotten, lay wrapped in each other, alive, together, chosen, forever.